We've got the best intentions, an idea or two. Too stressed, too busy, too few. But if we're gonna stop the war planes and turn this world around for peace and social justice, we've gotta find some common ground. Some say it is racism that causes injustice and war. Some say it's capitalism, always pushing for more. So many desperate people hanging by a thread. No job, no dinner, no bed. But if we're gonna stop the war planes and turn this world around for peace and social justice, we gotta find some common ground. Some say macho leaders can rule the world with a gun. Some blame religious zealots who hate everything fun. Go look outside your window, not at that TV screen. Hard rain, no shelter, bad scene. Woo-hoo, but if we're gonna stop the war planes and turn this world around for peace and social justice, we gotta find some common ground. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Oh, oh, oh. We can learn from each other, I'm sure. But don't let the carpenters fight the zinc or the plumbers lay the floor. The architects know where to put the walls. Just keep them away from the power saw. Let's go. Some work through the system and take it to the senator's door. Some do things that lead to jail and see it as war. So much is in the balance. Why argue which way is right? Stand up, get active, unite. If we're gonna
if all the technology works right, and you're welcome to share it from there with others. And welcome to our video audience. I'm Joan Johnson-Lewis, leader of the Riverdale Yonker Society for Ethical Culture, and I'm excited to speak today on the general theme of attention, which is our theme of the month. And particularly, I'm going to talk today about what we pay attention to in our history and how that shapes our understanding of reality and how we act in the world. You know, the song reminds me that when you're with a group, there's multiple ways that you can be on the same wavelength in what you're doing. And one is that you can have a story imposed from above by one or more powerful people, and the other is what is authentic common ground, which is when you really listen to the perspectives of everyone who's there. So I'm going to begin with a quote. To those who followed Columbus and Cortez, the New World seemed truly incredible because of the natural endowments. The land often announced itself with a heavy scent miles out into the ocean. Giovanni de Verrazzano in 1524 smelled the cedars of the East Coast 100 leagues out. The men of Henry Hudson's Half Moon were temporarily disarmed by the fragrance of the New Jersey shore, while ships running farther up the coast occasionally swam through large beds of floating flowers. Wherever they came inland, they found a rich riot of color and sound, of game and luxuriant vegetation, and of people. Had they been other than they were, they might have written a new mythology here. As it was, they took inventory. Frederick Turner. Now, if you've read much of American history, you know of Frederick Jackson Turner, whose essay on the frontier influenced generations of historians. The idea that American history, by which he meant the history of what became the USA, was shaped by first the availability of vast free land, and then by the closing of that availability in the 1890s. Now, I've been unable to find the exact quotation of that in any of Turner's writings. I copied it down many, many years ago because it was striking to me, that concept of taking inventory. I don't even know if it's by that Frederick Turner, or there's another Frederick Turner who's a poet who's also written about the impact of history. But that question about taking inventory is a very important one. What if, when ships began to cross the Atlantic Ocean, and those ships came to this beautiful and occupied land, they had not had a goal of taking inventory, of seeing not just the land as property, but also the people? Now, I've seen that quote used by writers who want us to face the realities of the environmental crisis. That we do not have seemingly infinite availability of resources. That myth that we have this forever has been part of Western and USA culture. That availability was always more limited than the culture of the pioneer and the explorer imagined. And I added the reality of people to the quote. There was not just beauty and wonder here, that fragrance of the New Jersey shore that Henry Hudson and his people encountered. There were people here, diverse people, not all cultures the same. The European culture at the time of its injection into this land was perfectly poised to take inventory of both land and people. Inventory instead of recognizing them as people, with ways of life, with relationships with the land already, and with relationships with each other. That has profoundly influenced the mythology of our country. You know, mythology is one of those words that can mean almost two opposite things, depending on how you're using it. Like seeding a tomato or pepper means you remove the seeds, but if you seed a garden, you put seeds into it. You deactivate your alarm by turning it off, but when your alarm is already active, it goes off. You screen a movie when it is shown, and you screen an area that you want hidden. Belief is also another word like that. It's sometimes used to describe the state when you have enough evidence to have confidence. And it's sometimes used to say that you will accept something without evidence. And so the word mythology is also one of those words. It can mean something which we know to be untrue. And it can mean what deeply shapes what we think is true. The mythology of the encounter of people from Europe with the rest of the world is one of conquest and ownership. And the mythology could have been otherwise. A cultural mythology shapes how we pay attention and what we pay attention to. The mythology thus influences what we think is true and how we act. You know, most of us in school were taught a fairly simplistic story of the arrival of Europeans in this land. And that simple story is part of and creates the mythology which still shapes how we believe and act today. I know a woman in New York City who owns a rather typical New York City multi-floor building. She bought it many years ago when most of the people in the neighborhood were, like her, African Americans, and realty prices were a lot lower in relationship to available wealth and income. The process of neighborhood change continued, and more affluent white people bought houses on her block. Shops which had specifically served the African American community, for instance, hairdressers, barbers, restaurants, moved out and moved on, and different businesses moved in. Fast forward to a neighborhood meeting with almost all the homeowners there attending were all white, almost all, and mostly fairly young. My friend was there, now in a small minority, and she hears the earliest of these new owners introduced as the pioneers. And she thinks, what does that make me in their eyes? The mythology of settlement and colonialism is with us still, along with that mythology that there are primitive people to be displaced. In Frederick Jackson Turner's view, there was a turning point in America around 1890 when the superintendent of the census declared that the country no longer had a frontier for settlement. At that time, Turner thought we had to adjust our nation to a new national mythology. But did we really adjust it, or are we still embodying that old myth? Certainly the people in that neighborhood in New York City were still embodying that myth. Well, here's something that Frederick Jackson Turner wrote during that previous era, and let's think about that era in which he was writing was known sometimes as the Gilded Age, an era which many find parallels to today. He wrote, "So long as free land exists, the opportunity for a competency exists, and economic power secures political power. But the democracy born of free land, strong in individualism and selfishness, intolerant of administrative experience and education, and pressing individual liberty beyond its proper bounds, has its dangers as well as its benefits. Individualism," he writes, "in America has allowed a laxity in regard to government affairs, which has rendered possible the spoils system and all the manifest evils that follow from the lack of a highly developed civic spirit. In this connection may be noted also the influence of frontier conditions in permitting lax business honor, inflated paper currency, and wildcat banking." Whew, so much of that situation reflects conditions today, when again our time is called a new Gilded Age, with immense power and wealth differences between the wealthiest and the poorest. I think one of the ways this plays out today is in the mythology, a romantic mythology of the rural white voter. Such voters are actually a minuscule part of our population, but they've certainly had enough newspaper stories in the last couple of years. Their effect on elections is much less than that of the affluent suburban voter. You know, the suburban voter, you can think about, is still part of a process that we are still moving out and absorbing rural farmland, displacing those romanticized rural voters. That frontierness continues. Yet those rural voters are in a place where they blame their displacement not on the people who are directly pushing them out, building tall office buildings in townhouse neighborhoods on some of the richest agricultural land in this country. Instead, they blame immigrants and people of color. You know, Turner's hypothesis is no longer accepted fully by historians. It has been critiqued in many quarters for good reason. He created a counter myth with his essay, the idea that democracy flourished by our expansion. But what also flourished was a kind of individualism which works against human flourishing because it ignores how we are interconnected in ever more complex ways. One of the ways in which Turner's hypothesis is no longer fully accepted, he talks about free land. And it was without cost in money to the people who moved, but it wasn't free. He largely ignored the fact that the land was not empty. He, in fact, bought into the same mythology he was trying to counter. In that same essay, Turner theorized that westward settlement allowed an avoidance of complexity, as most cultures around the world were experiencing a different evolution towards complexity. It was a change, he said, from what he called the primitive economic and political conditions of the frontier into the complexity of city life. The settlement of the western part of what would become the USA was a different phenomenon than what was being experienced in the East, which was industrialization with its own problems. But Turner largely ignores other perspectives when he does this with his essay. He is speaking of the culture of the mostly European heritage settlers expanding into the west of the continent. He writes this about the supposed uniqueness of USA culture. In the case of most nations, however, the development has occurred in a limited area. And if the nation has expanded, it has met other growing peoples whom it has conquered. You know, he later makes some brief references to the Native Americans, theorizing that when the European settler encountered that edge of civilization, that settler became primitive like an Indian. He acknowledges briefly that there were Indian wars, which we might see today as wars of resistance. And he sees what he calls the slavery question as a, quote, incident. You know, we are this year finishing a commemoration nationally of 400 years since the settling of Jamestown, a beginning of a mythology about what this country is and who we are as Americans. The New York Times has published recently an incredible series called 1619, which suggests that we have too long paid attention just to the English-speaking men and women, a few women at least, who came from over the seas to settle. Well, it wasn't really about their settlement either, if you really read why those people came. They came to exploit the land and make money for their sponsors back in England to compete with the Spanish and Portuguese in Europe. But the Times series correctly suggests we should also pay attention to the 20 people from Africa who arrived that year, who were rowed ashore to be servants, to be sold as servants, under control of those who paid for them. This was the beginning of the development of a system that over time gradually more rigidly controlled and treated those servants of African descent differently from those of European descent. The peculiar institution of American chattel slavery. So we are asked with a series like that to shift our attention and to see a new perspective on American history. We are asked to notice that two different things happened at exactly the same time. One was that English settlers were establishing a right of Englishmen to meet and vote equally on their conditions. And two, the status of Africans began its long devolution towards American chattel slavery. That old view, Jamestown is the beginning of democracy, is not the only view. And yet it's the view that many of us were taught in our school books. As a humanist, I think I'm required to pay attention to all the human beings who are involved. The Africans were also humans, and their enslavement alongside and developing in parallel to supposed freedom and opportunity are also part of the American mythology. Attention on 1619, 400 years ago, is helpful in highlighting that basic paradox at the root of American culture and adding complexity to the simple story of Europeans coming to this continent. At the same time, we're born a kind of egalitarianism and a kind of rigid stratification and inequality. And also was born a mythology which allowed the cultural errors of that egalitarianism to not pay attention to the stratification and inequality as a contradiction. And yet there's actually even more to pay attention to if, as humanists, we value humanity. The 1619 story also ignores something, multiple things. One thing it ignores is the encounter with the indigenous people, indigenous cultures that were already established in America. The 1619 story now being told includes a story of Africans in America, but even that story centers on an English-speaking New World. One estimate is that by 1619, 500,000 Africans had already crossed the Atlantic. Most, but not all, forced into that passage. 500,000 before 1619. Now, the history I was taught in school was profoundly centered on white and English-speaking Europeans. It largely ignored the humanity of everyone else. It also largely ignored the world context of that history. Yeah, we learned, I remember that moment in history when Spain and Portugal got together and divided the world in half between them. And we learned a little bit about the competition of the Dutch, the Swedes briefly, and the English to take part of that world away from Spain or Portugal. But notice where the attention was. We largely did not pay attention to how dividing that world was also a decision to ignore the full humanity of so many people. Our mythology is about settlers and colonizers and pioneers and frontiers people. And even within that, mostly focusing on the activities of the men. But just as in that gentrified neighborhood in New York that I described earlier, pioneers did not encounter empty land. They were encountering and displacing people. This month, our theme is attention. What would it mean if we paid more attention to our national mythologies and how we are still formed by these mythologies? You know, here was Frederick Turner trying to focus on the ways that frontier and settler mythology created a false mythology of individual success and opportunity. There were some seeds of truth in that mythology, but only for some people. From another perspective, settlers were invaders. Colonists were occupiers. The fathers of freedom were enslavers. Back to that other quote from Turner. In the case of most nations, however, The development has occurred in a limited area, and if the nation has expanded, it has met other growing peoples whom it has conquered. That the peoples that the European invaders encountered were not growing peoples was a key factor in how that expansion here could be so quick. We now know that disease played a large role in the story. The occasionally purposeful but mostly unconscious transmission of disease meant that those fleeing overpopulation back in Europe met shrinking peoples, not growing peoples here. And they met them on an incredibly massive scale. And yet Turner is able to ignore that the reason that the indigenous peoples were not at a stable or growing size was itself a result of the invasion. And not only that, but many of the people in the expansion were not here of their free will. And that was part of a longer history of conquest and invasion and seeing people as property. What we pay attention to shapes what we see. I don't know how many of you have seen, to shift our focus for a minute, that famous experiment on attention, where people are asked to watch a film where people are playing basketball, and you're supposed to count how many times the ball is passed between people. How many of you have seen that film? Okay, go look for it on YouTube. I'm going to spoil it, though, for you. The experiment was first published in 1999, one of the many in the last 30 or 40 years, helping us understand that our minds don't actually work the way we think they do. I've showed that in groups, and I'll tell you that if you haven't seen it before or heard it spoiled, you would be among the people actively counting how many times the ball is passed. And almost everyone who does that is blissfully ignorant of a man in a gorilla suit who walks right through the middle of the game. It's amazing how you don't even see it. Many people I've seen take this in are skeptical that this film was doctored and that there really wasn't a gorilla suit. And some people, when they see the video again, believe it was doctored. We have a bias when we are focusing on one thing, that we don't see other things. We also have a bias to see things from our own perspective. It's really hard to try to see what reality would be like from another perspective, because it is in part an act of creative imagination and often will not be accurate. We are not the other person, so we can't fully know. But we are much more likely to look at situations from our own perspective and from the perspective of those who we identify as like us. And thus, when we talk about truths of history, we are often like those people watching that basketball game, counting what we think counts. We don't have to actively ignore the rest. We just do. We cannot fully know the reality and complexity of what happened in the past. But by figuring out how to focus differently than we have, we can see more of it. You know, in my own family history, I knew from early childhood the names of all my grandparents. I knew them as people in person. I actually got to meet all four. I also knew the names of two, but only two of my great-grandparents. Well, I've often thought about why that was. Well, it's actually, I think, pretty simple. Those two that I know were immigrants, as were the other three of my grandparents. The immigrants were the beginning of our American story as a family, in the mythology that what counts is what happens here. And so I largely didn't even care about who those people were that were left and before them. I also, largely as a child, didn't question the stories in school about American history unless there were adults in my life who gave me alternative perspectives to look at. But those relatives of mine largely came at the very end of enslavement, to a state where enslavement was never legal, And so that didn't feel to be the same as part of our history either. It was another part of the country that had that history. You know, I did know a few family stories that poked at this mythology a little bit. There was the story that when my great-grandparents settled in northern Wisconsin, they may have settled, but the land wasn't so settled. There were still wars between people whose ancestors had access to that land for many generations, and the new people who, in almost an unconscious way, saw the land as open and available to them. And I heard some stories about that encounter of my great-grandfather, especially, with those people. How he had been surprised when he got here to find that the land was occupied, and how he translated that into a requirement to see those people as neighbors too. It is possible to shift our attention. You can watch that basketball video and see the gorilla if you are consciously trying to. And then sometimes people get distracted, even if they're trying to see the gorilla, and they still miss it. It's a fascinating film. Go see it. And so it is with history. The 1619 series helps us to shift our attention, to offset some of the long indoctrination with a cultural mythology that centers on white European men. Those men are still part of the history. What a change in perspective does is not ignore them either, but allows us to see more, and also to see the complex relationships among them. None of this is comfortable. You know, a lot of people who saw that gorilla and basketball tape thought it was faked, because it is uncomfortable when we find out that our own minds, by selective attention, miss part of reality. If you watch the video with the intention and intention to see that gorilla, you're going to miss how many times the ball gets passed. To see the whole figure, you have to see it more than once. And thus, with cultural mythology, if we want to see the more complex reality in question, if we want to see the more complex reality and we want to question the mythology as the whole truth, we have to get more practiced at perspective taking. Read that Times series. Read it again. Read critiques that look at the history of enslavement from the African perspective, not just the white and English perspective. Read one of the books now coming out, but the history of this continent, who try to see it from the Indigenous perspective. One of my favorites is called An Indigenous People's History of the United States. It attempts to see the whole range of history from the perspective of Indigenous people, written by Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz. She's also written other books as well that help you see the gorilla that's walking across the court. Now there's even an adaptation of her book on American history for middle grade and up, so that students even younger can begin to see history more critically and begin to take in the complexity that is real. We had a book discussion that ran here, some of you were part of it, that just finished reading Stamped from the Beginning. A really skillful look at history that we think we already knew, but paying attention to threads that we usually have not seen, though they've always been there. There are important new histories of how America has treated later immigrants. Surely we see in front of our very own eyes that there are competing myths about immigrants. One is that the inclusive welcome of the energy of immigrants is part of America. And the other is that immigrants are a threat to American stability. There's stories and images about whose America this is. Mythologies about how much this is a land of people and which people matter. Mythologies about how much this is a place to take whatever can be taken. A place where everyone is independent. Or a myth of how we are all connected. We approach Thanksgiving late this month. and likely we'll see it in the context of our culture's mythology, it's a particularly appropriate time to think more critically about what we pay attention to. We have learned to think, most of us, more critically about that mythological encounter on that supposed first Thanksgiving. More complex truths help us understand how dependent the colonizers were and how much they betrayed those who they intended to displace. How Massachusetts, and not Virginia, was the first of the English colonies to legalize enslavement. How dependent we are even today on the wealth built by taking land from some and forcing the labor of others. It is all part of the complex story, and only repeated and deliberate attention will help us to begin to see more of the whole, by seeing different parts than just those that are convenient to see, or that we have been directed to see, that reinforce our confidence that we are informed and educated. You know, when I say we, it also includes the descendants of the enslaved and the descendants of the conquered and displaced. Many have been denied hearing the perspective of their own ancestors and unconsciously have adapted to the overall cultural myth, at least in part. So what if those European ancestors had not seen this land mainly as an opportunity to take inventory? What if they saw the people who were here and recognized them fully as people, instead of being in the way of seizing new inventory? What if they saw the people of Africa as people and not inventory? And how might we today escape that deep cultural pull that tries to see people as inventory? I think the answer to it all really is rooted first in attention. Deliberate attention to what has been invisible or unquestioned or even deliberately hidden. And being willing to be uncomfortable when we realize what we did not see and what we will still keep finding sometimes difficult to see. You know, if I could assign ethical homework, it would be for you this month to read a work of history from a non-Eurocentric perspective, from a Black perspective, from an Indigenous perspective. If not a whole book, then maybe an article a week. We have some control over our attention. And so for this month, let's be people of intention. I'm going to give you a few minutes to think about any responses you'd like to make. And while we're doing that, I'm going to pass the basket where we share responsibilities for our community and the wider world. Half of the undesignated contributions this week will support the work of the society, and half we will share with an organization with which we share values. To pay attention to the reality that the Indigenous people were not just those people who were met in the initial waves of settlement, but live in New York City today. We're sharing today with the American Indian Community House. And we will say goodbye now to our live stream audience. Okay. So if you'd like to share a concise response to today's